Hey everybody, this is Byron and
Susie
And me.
and Brighton.
Brighton.
Hi.
There
There
it
he
is.
is. It's an eyeball.
Okay. Well, this is this is Daniel. We're in Daniel now, so we've looked at Lamentations, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, right, and now we're in Daniel. So we're going to be doing probably 2 weeks on Daniel, and in our book that we have here, it's about 4 pages long. But what we've decided is we're going to go through the book, the first 4 points in the book, and then we're just going to talk about the first 6 chapters.
Because it's
for
too
this time.
good. It gives such just the bare bones of an overview, and it's just such a good book, and so we can't do it. So we're gonna just
So-
dive in a little bit deeper.
So that's what we're going to do. For those of you that follow the book, we're going to do the first 4 points, kind of going to put the book aside, go through this first 6 books, and the first 6 chapters, go through that way. Now you'll notice if you're following along in your book that there are points like point 6, point 7, other little spots along the way that mention what we're talking about. And next week when we get to that, we'll have an understanding about them. And then it will all kind of make sense next time. So we're going to dive in. We're going to start at the beginning, talking about the book itself and the person that wrote it. Well, we know who wrote it, and that person is Daniel, right?
Yes.
So a couple of things. This is really cool. If you want to talk a little bit about it, I'm going to pull this up on the Bible here.
Okay. So Daniel, one of the things that it says that is really cool, and we've noticed that Daniel has been named by, I guess it was Ezekiel that we saw last. Daniel is one of those few people that whenever he's mentioned in Scripture, it's only good. Like, he did all good stuff. So it says Daniel is one of the few men about whom God says only good. 3 times he is referred to as the greatly beloved one. And so with Daniel were also his 3 friends who were also just really faithful and loyal to God in the midst of this Babylonian nation where, anything goes. You can do whatever you want to, and most people did. But Daniel and his 3 friends, we know that at least 4 people, and then Ezekiel comes in, so at least 5 people remain faithful to God. But you know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But that's not their real names. That is their Babylonian names. Because in Babylon, whenever they went there, they were renamed.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay, so what I wanted to point out was what you just said, what you started with. In Daniel, at least 3 times, he is referred to. This is a passage. This is Daniel chapter 9, verse 23. In our book, he calls him the greatly beloved. But in my translation, it says it this way: you are very precious to God. So here is a verse. This is Daniel chapter 9, verse 23. The moment you began praying, a command was given. And now I am here to tell you what it was. For you are very precious to God. Listen carefully so that you can understand the meaning of your vision. So at least 3 times, my Bible says, you are very precious to God. In our text, in our book, because of the version he's using, I think is the King James, it says the greatly beloved one. So anyway, that stood out to me when I was reading. That's why I wanted to, it's in our book here, but when I was just reading Daniel, it really stood out to me. I was like, that's interesting. He says you are very precious to God, which I think is neat.
And just to throw this out there, because Daniel has a lot in common with Revelation. And the visions that Daniel was given were some of the things that were kept secret from Daniel were then revealed to John, who's the beloved disciple.
Right.
Right? So the people most precious to God, he entrusted with the greatest visions and the dreams of what's going to happen, at the very end of all time, which is just super awesome.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a little bit about Daniel. One thing I thought was neat in the book, he says the name Daniel means God is judge, which I That's interesting as well. So we know. Did you talk about the first part of this?
I
about
did not.
8 years before.
But I think that it's cool to kind of get like a whole timeline of kind of where all of these people are. So I kind of wrote it out.
So the three we're talking about are Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. So you get an understanding of, they were around the same time. They were contemporaries of each other. And they're writing, their books are being written around the same time. And so it's good to understand how they intertwine. Go ahead if you want to read it.
So if you just start in 627 BC, Jeremiah becomes a prophet in Judah. So Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, before they were all in Judah together. Mm-hmm. So Jeremiah starts prophesying in 627. And then in 606, that's when Daniel is taken captive to Babylon. So he's one of those first people that, probably, either like descendants of royalty or just, really smart, wise, good-looking people.
And here, in Daniel, he talks about, in chapter 1, he says, bring the best, it's verse 3, I think. Bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who have been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men. So that's probably why he was taken in the first little raid anyway. Go ahead.
So then 3 years later, that's when Daniel interprets his first dream, which we'll talk about that. And then, 6 years after that, in 597, Ezekiel was taken captive. So he was still in Judah, but then in the second wave, Ezekiel was taken captive to Babylon. And then as soon as he is taken captive, that's when God first speaks to him. Mm-hmm. And so he starts prophesying there. So Daniel, since we're focusing on Daniel, you see in one of the chapters where it says, he was reading the word of the Lord as revealed to Jeremiah. Correct. So he's reading what Jeremiah has written. He probably also heard Jeremiah prophesying when he was in Judah before he's taken.
Yep.
Then when he is in Babylon, he's probably hearing Ezekiel. I mean, Ezekiel.
There's a good chance.
Good possibility because Ezekiel kind of did some far out stuff.
Yeah.
So there's that. In 587,
now they were living completely different.
Yeah, right. But
anyway.
But still, I think you'd hear about Ezekiel.
Yeah.
You would think anyway.
You would think somebody'd hear about Ezekiel.
In 587, that's when the fiery furnace took place. So if you want to rewind this and kind of write this down, I think to me it's super helpful.
Mm-hmm. It is.
In 586, so 1 year after the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that's when Judah falls and Jerusalem is destroyed. Yeah. And then just for kicks, I think it's really interesting. It's right in between when Judah fell and then Daniel in the lion's den, like these little, what's about 50 years that was in there. That's when you have Pythagoras is over in ancient Greece, like doing his math, music thing, which is pretty cool. To me, I think that's neat just to see who else was in the world at that time. And also Confucius was in China. Doing his thing. So all of this is happening at the same time in the world, which is so cool. And then Daniel is thrown into the lion's den in 539 BC. And then in 538 is when the first exiles are allowed to return to Judah. And also at the same time as Pythagoras and Confucius, that's when the first Roman census was taken. And so Rome, we're going to see, is a big player later on in the book of Daniel. And the first Roman census had 84,700 citizens. So you take this small little thing, and then you just see it grow.
See it explode.
Become this world power. So I think that's really interesting to kind of see the timeline.
Okay, so now I know a little bit about who he was. Now the book of Daniel, so he's an Old Testament prophet, but he wrote apocalyptic writing. And we see apocalyptic writing in Daniel and then obviously in Revelation. And that
apocalypse,
means,
can I just say, it's just kind of a scary word.
Oh, is it?
to me, it is like apocalyptic. You know, it's like the apocalypse. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like, I don't know. Is it like he does this, and I hate when he does it. But like sometimes he'll read the last page or the last chapter of a book before he reads the whole thing. He's like, "Well, I want to see if I want to read it." Right? And
I want to know what happens.
That I cannot handle it. But anyway, so I just like I want to do that, but then I have to start at the beginning and read all the way through. But apocalyptic literature is just something that tells you how it's all going to work out in the end. And we know, being Christians, that God wins. So that's a really awesome thing. So these books like Daniel and Revelation, don't let them scare you, because I think they're scary to people that don't read them and try to understand them. Like, there's a lot of far out stuff. If you look at the boys' like Comic Action Bible, like some of the drawings are like, whoa.
Yeah.
But we know that God faithfully protects his people, and we know that he wins.
Right.
In the end.
He does.
Everything is going to be made right and is going to be made new. So
the thing is, like, what apocalypse means, he says it well, an unveiling of the secret purposes of God. So it's not scary, because it's just laying out what's going to happen. And they're secretive to God because we can't understand it all, but he gives us a glimpse of what's going to happen. So there's a lot of hope in it, and if you go into things understanding that, it makes it a lot easier, I think.
And it's called that, like, progressive revelation, where God doesn't just tell you everything all at once because he knows we can't handle it. He just gives you little bits.
Right.
Little bits and pieces. And we do that with our kids. And you do that with, anything.
We do it with everything,
with
because
our
you
marriage.
can't understand everything all at once.
Absolutely.
So you have to do it in small doses. Anyway, so more about apocalyptic writing. I like it.
I mean, that word is just kind of like, apocalypse now. They might like a Clockwork Orange and all those, like, just, I don't know. We've made it a word that it's not. We've made it a negative thing. It's
not. Okay, so anyway, in Daniel, he shows Daniel visions. So in Daniel, we see a lot of visions. And this is interesting, the book points out, and I wanted to point it out too. It says in the book of Daniel, the word vision or visions appears 32 times. Just a sidebar, which is interesting. So some of the themes of this book of Daniel, it's interesting that he points out here. So what we see, that the themes of Daniel are the themes of New Testament prophecy. So New Testament prophecy and in the book of Daniel, we see very similar things. And here are some of the things he points out, which is so interesting. Number 1, manifestation of the man of sin. 2, the great tribulation. 3, the return of the Lord. 4, the resurrections. And then 5, the judgments. Very interesting. And when you look at New Testament prophecy and you look at Revelation, you're going to see the same thing. So it's really interesting. And another thing, this is another thing that's pointed out here. This says Daniel is distinctly the prophet of the period of the Gentiles. So the reason it talks about that is because Jerusalem is destroyed. And so God's people are now uprooted and spread out. And people ruling in Judah are not God's people. And so it's called the period of the Gentiles, and this goes all the way up basically till Jesus. Obviously you have people ruling there, but it's called the period of the Gentiles. You can check that in Luke 21:24. Okay? I think that's really all I have to say about the book. The first, I'm going to skip. Well, no, I'm going to skip. Let's go ahead to part 3.
The central truth.
Yeah.
Is really important, and that's it says, see Daniel chapter 4 verses 17, 25, and 32. But the central truth of Daniel is that the Most High God, he rules in the kingdom of men, and he giveth it to whomsoever he will. So
I'm going to tell you what it says. Check this.
Yeah.
This is so it's not King James wordage.
Yeah.
Okay.
You didn't like King James wordage?
Yeah, I mean, it's fine. So the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world, and he gives them to anyone he chooses. That's what it boils down to. God rules. he sets things up. I mean, like just the census, like looking at the census that was taken in Rome with their 84,000 people, and then you see just sometime later their army is that big. So God sets things in motion. And one of the things, I was rereading some of Daniel, and it's interesting because just right at the beginning, when Nebuchadnezzar comes in and takes stuff, when he pulls the people, God allows him to take certain golden objects back to Babylon. Why? So that Belshazzar later will pull them out. So it's like he's already setting the whole thing up in motion. You can see it set up. It's set up. So anyway, God rules. He tells people when they're going to rule, what they're going to do, and basically follow him. Cool.
All right, and then the structure of the book. So that's point 4, and this is
where... Wait, there's one other thing.
What?
One other thing in point 3. They're talking about the theme, because I thought this was neat. The theme in Daniel is essentially the same that's in Ezekiel, which is the other book that's in captivity. Yeah. So Ezekiel's theme was, they will know that I am the Lord. Mm-hmm. Ezekiel's theme is, they will know that I am the Lord. Daniel's theme, the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world. He gives them to anyone he chooses. So you can see a correlation here. Anyway, I wanted to put that in there. It is the sovereignty of God. All right, go ahead. The structure.
So the structure of the book, the first 6 chapters, so it's 12 chapters, and that's it, which is really cool. But the first 6 deal with, kind of history, things that, that we have seen take place. And then chapters 7 through 12 are prophecies. So visions that Daniel gets from the Lord, and then prophecies of the end times.
Right. So the historical side is the stuff that everybody knows. Mm-hmm. When you read the first 6 chapters, you're flipping the pages. It's great. Yeah. Then you go to chapter 7, and it's like, put on the brakes.
It's a lot. So that's why we're dividing this video into 2 segments. So right now, we're just going to do the stuff that's more familiar to you. So let's just get right to it.
We're going to dive in.
So we're just going to start in chapter 1. And verse 1 says, during the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God.
That's what I was talking about earlier. Yeah.
So it says, so Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. So just a couple of things that I think are important to talk about is just Babylon. This is where the whole book is set. And Babylon is a really important place in Scripture. It is the only place that's mentioned besides Jerusalem. It's the second place that's mentioned the most. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that right, but like Jerusalem is mentioned like who knows how many times. Babylon is the second city that's mentioned in the Bible, and it's mentioned 290 times. And where Jerusalem is like the city of God and the city of God's people, Babylon is described as like the worldly city, the city that sets itself up against the things of God. So let's go where it's first mentioned. So Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 through 12 is where we first see Babylon mentioned. And then you're going to see it mentioned a couple of times in succession. So Genesis, go ahead.
Cush was also the ancestor of Nimrod, who was the first heroic warrior on earth. Since he was the greatest hunter in the...
The first heroic warrior on earth was from, Babylon. Anyway, go ahead.
Since he was the greatest hunter in the world, his name became proverbial. People would say, this man is like Nimrod, the greatest hunter in the world. He built his kingdom in the land of Babylonia, with the cities of Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh.
Okay, so we can stop there. And then, so the first great warrior sets his kingdom up in Babylon, and then we're going to see in Revelation the last great warrior against God's people is in Babylon. So anyway, so just kind of keep that, in your mind. That's the first mention, and then we're going to see the last mention here in a little bit. But if you just turn the page, probably Genesis 11, chapter 1. You're very familiar with this, I'm sure. This is the Tower of Babel. It says, at one time, all the people of the world spoke the same language and used the same words. As the people migrated to the east, and the east is just kind of, in the Bible also like moving further away from Eden. But anyway, they found a plain in the land of Babylonia and settled there. They began saying to each other, let's make bricks and harden them with fire. And so I'm sorry, I can read this, forever because I get really excited. But basically you all know that they decided to build a tower in Babylon to make a name for themselves. Instead of making God's name great, they wanted to make a name for themselves. So when they did that, then the Lord, it says, but the Lord came down to look at the city and the tower the people were building. Look, he said, the people are united and they all speak the same language. After this, nothing they set out to do will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down and confuse the people with different languages. Then they won't be able to understand each other. So we have this biblical, well, not biblical, it's like a world events timeline. And right after the Tower of Babel, you see just, there's very few things. And then the Tower of Babel happens and all of a sudden it's just like lots of different like empires and countries and stuff like that. So anyway, it's interesting. So again, you see in Babylon just pridefulness, setting themselves up against God. Then again, if you just turn the page, it's in chapter, well, you don't have to turn the page. Chapter 11, verse 31. It says, one day Terah took his son Abram, his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and his grandson Lot, his son Haran's child, and moved away from Ur of the Chaldeans, and that's Babylon of the Chaldeans. He was headed for the land of Canaan. And so God, was already removing Abraham from Babylon. And then we're going to see, the descendants of Abraham, the Israelites, taken back there.
Yeah.
Right to the very beginning. And God kind of likes to do that sometimes, gives us do-overs. So, what else? Okay, so then let's look at the very kind of the last, the very ending. Revelation chapter 17, verses 1 through 5. You want to read that one?
Yeah. One of the seven angels who had poured out the seven bowls came over and spoke to me. Come with me, he said, and I will show you the judgment that is going to come on the great prostitute who rules over many waters. The kings of the world have committed adultery with her, and the people who belong to this world have been made drunk by the wine of her immorality. So the angel took me in the spirit into the wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that had 7 heads and 10 horns, and blasphemes against God were written all over it. The woman wore purple and scarlet clothing and beautiful jewelry made of gold and precious gems and pearls. In her hand she held a gold goblet, which, interesting, gold goblet, full of obscenities and the impurities of her immorality. A mysterious name was written on her forehead, Babylon the Great, mother of all prostitutes and obscenities in the world. So, it's just when you see all of those things back to back, it's just kind of, and that's just verse 1 and 2 of Daniel. It's just so rich and so full of just good stuff. And just, food for thought, Babylon is modern day Baghdad. So in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein's palace was, that was, in the same kind of place. Like he was trying to rebuild the city of Babylon, which is really interesting. Because when I think of Saddam Hussein, I think of the person that terrified me when I was in 5th grade. I used to watch the news about, like Operation Desert Storm, and I was fearful. And I remember that. So thankfully he was, subdued, but, we can probably look there to find, somebody in the end that will, be somebody setting themselves up against God.
Okay. So that's kind of like Babylon, and kind of where that is in Scripture. And then let's look at Daniel, because Daniel was in Babylon, but he didn't let that change who he was.
Correct.
Which is so cool. So I think it's neat to read Psalm 137. Talks about, it's like the lament of an exile that's living in Babylon. You have that.
Mm-hmm.
Go for it.
It reminds me of that song, By the Waters of Babylon.
Yeah.
But anyway, beside the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept as we thought of Jerusalem. We put away our harps, hanging them on the branches of poplar trees, for our captors demanded a song from us. Our tormentors insisted on a joyful hymn. Sing us one of those songs of Jerusalem. But how can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a pagan land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget how to play the harp. May my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I fail to remember you, if I don't make Jerusalem my greatest joy. O Lord, remember what the Edomites did on the day the armies of Babylon captured Jerusalem. Destroy it, they yelled. Level it to the ground. O Babylon, you will be destroyed. Happy is the one who pays you back for what you have done to us. Happy is the one who takes your babies and smashes them against the rocks.
And so, one of the things that the psalmist says here is that, but how can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a pagan land? And that to me is just kind of the antithesis of what Daniel's view of being in Babylon is like, because he decides just to remain faithful. And because of his faithfulness, number one, God uses him greatly. But number two, he influences so many of
the kings.
The kings, like Nebuchadnezzar, trusts him immensely. Darius, the Persian king, trusts him immensely. Like he's promoted as far up as he possibly could be.
I've always wondered with the Nebuchadnezzar, we see that he turns to God, and I've always wondered if
he stayed.
Yeah, if he stayed with it. It's very interesting to think through that, like what happened with his heart. Where was he on all that? Anyway, let's go ahead with the.
Okay.
So are you done with your prelims?
I think so. I've got two things that I wrote down, but I don't think they fit here because I was just.
So we're gonna go.
Carried away.
We're gonna go to Daniel, and so open your Bible up to Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, and we'll go through it very quickly. So the very first chapter, we see Daniel taken captive. He's taken, and he and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we see them. They're all taken to Babylon. They're taken to the royal palace with several other people that have been taken captive, not just from Jerusalem, but other places. And because of their, who they were, what they looked like, they were chosen. And this is the chapter that that starts off where they are offered food from the king's table, and Daniel and these others deny that food, and they say, no, we're going to eat like what our Lord permits. We're not going to defile our bodies. So it's interesting because they knew the law that God had said, eat these things. And so they said, here's the deal. We're not going to eat, give us 10 days. We're going to choose to eat what we think we should, which is basically a vegetarian diet. And they said, and you feed everybody else from the king's table. At the end of 10 days, if we are healthier, then we continue to eat what we want. If they are healthier, basically, we will switch over. If we look weak, we'll switch over and eat what you want us to. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating from the food of the king. And so after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. And in that's the first time you see his faithfulness and their faithfulness to uphold what they knew was right. In the face of being told, no, you're going to do this, they went ahead and did what God wanted them to do. And it's interesting because of the very last verse of chapter 1, it ends with this statement. Daniel remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. So basically, most of his life, he's in the royal palace in the ear of the king. And he's around them because of his faithfulness. Yeah, because of his faithfulness. And it starts with the food. That's chapter 1. And there's a lot of stuff in it, but that's the main thing really there.
And so, just one thing, they, Babylon tried to make them Babylonians. Like they took the wisest of the young men, and then they trained them in Babylonian literature and customs. They gave them Babylonian names. So Daniel was called Belteshazzar, not to be confused with Belshazzar later. Is totally different later. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they were all named for, things, it's like, Daniel's God is my judge. Hananiah, I can't remember what it is, but they're all, it's like, who is like God? And then their names were changed to reflect Babylonian gods. So anyway, so that's Daniel chapter 1. Let's move on to Daniel chapter 2.
All right, chapter 2. And Susie loves the book of Daniel, if you can't say. It's like one of her favorites. I mean, we're going through this thing, and she's just like, her brain is in overdrive.
I can never learn enough, Like, there's always more to learn.
A ton of it, stuff in it. But chapter 2, in our as we run through it, chapter 2 is when Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and Daniel interprets. So I'm going to kind of run through the story. This is chapter 2. And the year that this happened, we think, is, again, around 603 BC. That's what scholars have come up with. So here we go. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. It really troubled him. And so he brings together all his astrologers and all of these, and he says, tell me the dream and what it means. And they're like, well, why don't you tell us the dream and we'll tell you what it means. He says, no, you tell me what I dreamed and tell me what it meant. And they're like, that's impossible.
I love this. Verse 11, it says, the king's demand is impossible. No one except the gods can tell you your dream, and they do not live here among people.
And
in my Bible, I wrote, oh, just you wait, because our God does live.
He does live here
with his people. Until we live with him, he dwells with us. So anyway, so cool. Sorry.
So yeah, that's verse 11. You should highlight. I've highlighted in my Bible because they didn't understand who God was. That's what it shows. And their gods didn't live there because they weren't real. But anyway, so here's what happens. So Daniel, they go to get Daniel, and one of the things.
Why has the king issued such a harsh decree?
Hang on, this is good. Verse 14. I love what it says in verse 14. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, by the way, all of these wise men ticked the king off, so he's like, fine, kill them all. Kill all the wise men. That included Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel, by the way. So the king's men, henchmen, I'll call him that, he goes to Daniel, and I love this, verse 14. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, came to kill them, Daniel handled the situation with wisdom and discretion. That is so cool. And then, why has the king issued this, he says. But anyway, Daniel says, hey, let me go listen to him. I know, my God is awesome. So Daniel goes, and he says, okay, king, here's what you dreamed.
First, though, he prayed.
Well, he does pray. That's verse 17, 18.
Yeah, he tells, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah to pray and to ask God for a vision, to ask God to show them the dream. So they all pray, but Daniel is the one that receives the vision. Mm-hmm. So
verse 19.
Imagine being those three guys and you're praying, I got nothing.
I got nothing either.
And but Daniel's the one that receives the vision. And so, first of all, he asked God to show him something, and I think that there's something there. But I love his praise to God. It says, then Daniel praised the God of heaven. And he says, praise the name of God forever and ever, for he has all wisdom and power. He controls the course of world events. He removes kings and sets up other kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the scholars. He reveals deep and mysterious things and knows what lies hidden in darkness, though he is surrounded by light. I thank you and praise you, God of my ancestors, for you have given me wisdom and strength. You have told me what we asked of you and revealed to us what the king demanded.
Now that's verses
So good.
19 through 23. And read it's amazing. You should underline that too. I've got it all highlighted in yellow. So so basically God obviously tells him what's happening. So Daniel goes to the king, tells him what happened, tells him what the dream was, and then interprets the dream.
But first, he gives God the glory for it too. Like I love those details. And Daniel says, he tells the king, there are no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or fortune tellers who can reveal the king's secret. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the future. So he's quick always to give God the glory first, and to seek God first before he does anything else.
So anyway, here you want to get that thing ready you have for them?
Oh yeah.
So anyway, we have this little felt board we'll show you. So here's what it is. This is
boards are awesome.
This is another very familiar thing that you'll know. So here's our little guy.
Our little statue.
So
I'm gonna put him beside you.
this is what most of you already know. This is a story that's very familiar, and this is the statue that.
See?
Yeah, they can see that.
All
So
right.
this is the statue that he dreams about, and it's made up of different types of metals and things of that nature.
Yeah.
And each part of that represents a different
Gentile
kingdom that's going to rule.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so one thing to notice is that it starts with, so we'll start with the head of gold.
Mm-hmm.
You want to go ahead and go through it? So the head of gold represents Babylon. And so he says, King Nebuchadnezzar are this head of gold. And then, so that's the Babylonian Empire. And then the silver, is that right? Chest and arms. Is that what it says?
Oh yeah, silver. Yeah.
The silver, I just want to make sure I'm not telling you wrong. Anyway, so the silver chest and arms, that represents the Medo-Persian Empire that came along.
During Belshazzar's feast.
Yes. And so it's got the two arms because the Medes and Persians were a joint kingdom. Mm-hmm. So then as you move down, then you have the bronze.
Its belly and thighs were bronze.
And that represents ancient Greece. So you're familiar with like Alexander the Great, who came in and just like swiftly conquered everybody. Mm-hmm. And then
its legs were iron.
Legs are iron, and that's the Roman Empire. And then the toes are like a mixture, the feet and toes.
Its feet is a combination of iron and baked clay.
Yeah. So we'll talk about all those later. But one thing just to think about is that as you go down the statue, as you go down the timeline of history, the quality of the materials get worse and worse and worse. So if you think about the values and the morals of the different nations that came along, they kind of got worse and worse and worse and worse. But they gained strength. So these are, iron is a lot stronger than gold, I'd say, right?
Right, yeah.
Until you get down kind of to the toes. The clay toes. So anyway, so there is Nebuchadnezzar's
there's
dream
the statue. And if you can, any of these things, as you read, if you're curious about, want to hear what we said again about which of those people ruled, there's tons of stuff online that you can look at, a lot of resources. So anyway, in the dream, a big rock comes in, knocks it all down, and smashes it. And then that's kind of basically how it ends there. At the end of the chapter, that's when Nebuchadnezzar puts Daniel. And you talk about Joseph. It's just like that. It's like just like Joseph in Egypt, but he puts Daniel basically in charge of everything. Daniel's put way up high, and the king said to Daniel. This is Daniel chapter 2, verse 47, and this is a really important verse. The king said to Daniel, "Truly, your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over kings, a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this secret." And I love that he says, your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over kings. And if you go back to the central truth again, the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world. he gives them to anyone he chooses. The king here says, the Lord, let's see, your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over kings. So, I mean, he says that himself. And that's basically, right here at the very end, Daniel requests his three friends to be put in charge of affairs as well. So the four of them are pushed way high in the kingdom as far as reigning. That's chapter 2.
And so I just want to say I think why I like Daniel so much is because, like for me, my faith is strengthened whenever, like God says he's going to do something and then I can see it happen.
Yeah.
Or I'll pray for something and then it happens. And so just a couple of things, like Isaiah, he predicted, number one, Isaiah was like spot on. He predicted the fall of Babylon. So like in Isaiah 47, verses 8 through 11, it says, "Listen to this, you pleasure-loving kingdom, living at ease and feeling secure. You say, I am the only one and there is no other. I will never be a widow or lose my children. Well, both of these things will come upon you in a moment. Widowhood and the loss of your children. Yes, these calamities will come upon you despite all your witchcraft and magic. You felt secure in your wickedness. No one sees me, you said. But your wisdom and knowledge have led you astray. And you said, I am the only one and there is no other. So disaster will overtake you and you won't be able to charm it away." Later on it says, "A catastrophe will strike you suddenly, one for which you are not prepared." And that perfectly describes what we're going to see later when
With Belshazzar.
Persians come in.
Yep.
And then, so Isaiah 44, Isaiah chapter 24, verses 28, and into chapter 45, he talks about the Medo-Persian Empire, which is the second, the silver chest and arms. He says, "When I say of Cyrus," I love this because he names the guy.
He names Cyrus.
So cool. "When I say of Cyrus, he is my shepherd. He will certainly do as I say. He will command, rebuild Jerusalem, and he will say, restore the temple. This is what the Lord says to Cyrus, his anointed one, whose right hand he will empower." So anyway, I love it because we've already read Isaiah. Mm-hmm. Isaiah predicted the stuff that now we're seeing happen in Daniel. Right. Daniel's going to predict stuff that we see happen in the future. So if, God is the same God yesterday, today, and forever. And so if the things that he said was going to happen have already happened and history has proven it to be true, then the things that have not yet happened
will happen.
They're going to happen.
Yeah.
So anyway, and then do you want to talk about the feet and the toes?
Yeah. We'll talk about the feet and the toes. Here you go. It's interesting. Go ahead.
So the feet and the toes, just things that I've read, it says that they may represent a political system yet to come. And the 10 horns later on, we'll talk about that.
That's in the second half of Daniel.
Yeah. They foretell like a 10 kingdom confederacy that will, work together and kind of move as one. And so it's like an article that I read somewhere, and I wish I would have, it's one of those things I wish I would have written down or copied it or printed it out or something. But anyway, basically the gist of it was that the Roman Empire, so like the legs that come down, the iron legs, if you think about that as kind of the ancestor to all of, or not all of, but a lot of modern nations. And so
set it up how we follow after what they did.
And so we talk about the Romance languages. All of those things were derivative of Latin, right? Mm-hmm. Which was in ancient Rome. So like you think about, Germany, and you think about France, and what are some of the other ones? I can't think. Italy, places like that. And even like in the language, like in Russia and Germany, and I didn't know this until I read this, but it just like blew my mind. The word Tsar, Tsar for, is that Russia?
Yes.
Or is that Germany? And then Czar for, I don't know which is which. But anyway, those two words, Tsar and Tsar, they come from the word Caesar, which is what Roman emperors were called. So anyway, so if you think about that, then I just think that that's kind of cool stuff to think about. Okay, I'm sorry. But then the most important part of the whole thing is that he also dreamed about, I needed a rock. Because that's the most important
part. The big rock
part.
rolling down. We talked about the rock already, yeah. But you can talk about this.
So Jesus is the rock. And Psalm 18, verses 22 through 24. Let's see. Do you have it? Uh-huh. Psalm 118, verses 22 through 24.
Says, the stone that the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing, and it is wonderful to see. This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it.
So I just think that's a cool...
Daniel chapter 3 at the very, very end, the last part, the last few verses, that's where it talks about the stone rolling away. It's not the last few verses, it's before the last verses. But the stone rolling and smashing those kingdoms to bits... That's Jesus.
And it will stand forever, it says. That is the meaning of the rock cut from the mountain, though not by human hands, that crushed to pieces the statue of iron, bronze, clay, silver, and gold. The dream is true, and its meaning is certain.
Yeah.
I like that.
And it happened as he said it would. Okay. You want to move on?
Yes.
We're going to move on to Daniel chapter 4. 3. I skipped 3. Skip 3. So Daniel chapter 3. And here, we'll show you this.
So, does that look familiar?
There we go.
So Nebuchadnezzar set himself up a gold statue, 90 feet tall, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he said, okay, whenever people of all races and nations and languages listen to the king's command, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. So the same blazing furnace probably that made this thing, that's the blazing furnace that we're talking about. Probably so. Like industrial size fiery furnace. So the dream that he had was this statue, right? Where like Babylon was the head of gold, and then all these other empires came and kind of conquered it. But Nebuchadnezzar says, you know what? I think it looks better this way. So
he just so I
don't think the dream had its desired effect of like humbling him. Like he should have been like, oh man, I need to get myself together, right?
He clearly
but
wasn't
now
humble.
He's like, you know what?
He will be later.
No, I'm going to be awesome. I'm sorry. I love felt things.
You do. Let's move on.
It's also very late. So
this is what a lot of you know. The 3 men in the fiery furnace, and then there's a 4th. This is a very familiar passage, and it's chapter 3 of Daniel. So we know before in chapter 2, at the end of it, Daniel asked for his friends to be promoted. They were. Well, they were different than other rulers because they were outstanding. God was with them. They made great decisions. They were like the best. And all of the other guys were jealous, didn't like it, and they wanted to find flaws with them. They couldn't. They could find no flaws. Same thing happened with Daniel when they tried to get Daniel. But here they are, they get him because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will not bow down to the statue. They say, King, you said they shouldn't bow down. King goes and gets the 3 guys, said, all right, I'm going to blast these instruments and this music. When I hit it, bow down. They said, no, blast the music. They stand there. You can read it.
Yeah, because I love this too. It says, and then what? God will be able to rescue you from my power. And again, just wait, because it's coming. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, oh, Nebuchadnezzar. Like, I love that because they didn't say, oh, King Nebuchadnezzar. They just said,
verse 16,
oh,
by the way.
Nebuchadnezzar. I love that. We do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. And this is probably one of my favorite verses in all of the scripture. But even if he doesn't, We want to make it clear to you, Your Majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Even if he doesn't, we are not going to bow. And I think that's just
that's
the
cool. That's
coolest thing.
verse 18. Mark it. Daniel chapter 3, verse 18. Now, obviously, we know the story, but if you don't, what happens is he is ticked at these guys. He's angry.
So he jacked up the furnace.
He made the furnace so hot. He says 7 times hotter. The guys, here's what's crazy.
Yeah.
So the guards throwing them in die from the flames, but they're throwing these guys in, and they're not dying, getting thrown in, but the guys throwing them in are dying because it's so hot. That's first clue that something's up. Yeah. So they get into the furnace.
And they're just not throwing, they're tied.
They are tied. They're bound in there.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is a great story. You have to read it. So he throws them in, and so look, it's...
But suddenly...
Verse 25. Well, verse 24, you can look at 24. Go ahead.
Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, Your Majesty, we certainly did," they replied.
Now verse 25. This is the big one.
Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god."
Now remember, it's important. They were bound. So their chains either they burned off or whatever they were shackled with. Either it burned off or God just took it off of them.
Was their bindings. Right? That's the only thing.
Yeah. If it was, God could have just taken it right off of them. Anyway, the best part is yet to come, because this again, it shows God's power to these kings. So the very next couple of actually it's 27 is the best one.
Well,
so in 26, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this is what the king says: servants of the Most High God. So see, because of this, Nebuchadnezzar now calls God. He calls them servants of the Most High God. Come out, come here. They step out. So they just walk out. And then this is the coolest part, 27. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. The best part, they didn't even smell of smoke. They didn't even smell like smoke. So not only did he rescue them, and he made them... they didn't even smell like it. I have a jacket that I needed to wash because we were burning some sticks, and the wind's blowing it away that way, right? I'm on this side of the smoke. Smoke's going over there. I'm over here throwing sticks on the fire. My jacket smelled horrible. Mm-hmm. They didn't even smell.
That's awesome.
So then the Nebuchadnezzar said, and this is verse 28, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into a hubble of heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." And so the point of that is, again, it goes back to the central truth. The Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world. And he sees it. Nebuchadnezzar sees it time and time again.
Yeah.
He sees it. Anyway, verse 30, the last verse, King promotes them to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. Okay, any other thoughts real quick before we move on?
Just one thing, God could have chosen to deliver Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fire. He could have said, put a stop to it, figured out some kind of...
Put a stop to it before they got to it.
Before they even got into it.
Yeah.
But he didn't. He chose to deliver them through it. So they...
Couple of lessons.
They went through the fire. They went through the fear of the fire before that happened too. Mm-hmm. But they got to walk unbound in a fiery furnace with, most people think, Jesus. And then, so not only was their faith just like skyrocket, I mean, just can you imagine what that would be like? But then also, what a witness for, King Nebuchadnezzar and everybody else around, like what that did for their faith. Mm-hmm. So there's two, sometimes we don't understand why, like maybe something is happening in our life, like why am I going through this? Why am I struggling through this? Why can't God just deliver me? God, why don't you just come down and save it, or take it all away, or change it? But God's purposes for our life are far greater than just our temporary.
Just moments. It's greater than the moments.
Yeah, and so sometimes He doesn't deliver you from it. Sometimes He delivers you through it. Mm-hmm. But He, we see that He walks with you through all of it. So I think that's just a great lesson there in chapter 3. Okay.
Okay, the next one.
This is probably going really long. I don't know.
We're probably gonna stop here pretty soon. The chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's dream.
But you could always stop and then come see it later.
It's true. So, yeah. Nebuchadnezzar's dream about a tree. This is chapter 4.
I love. Can I just the effect that it had on Nebuchadnezzar? It says, King Nebuchadnezzar sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. So in chapter 3, we saw that he sent out this thing, come worship my statue, mm-hmm. right? So in chapter 4, it says, peace and prosperity to you. I want you all to know about the miraculous signs and wonders the Most High God has performed for me.
Yeah.
And I kind of wrote in my Bible, this is what we need to share with an unbelieving world, like what God has done for me. It's one thing to say, hey, read the Bible, like look what He's done, all throughout history. And that resonates with some people, but some people, they need to know what God has done for you.
Yeah. And
sometimes you need to know what God has done for you. I try to write down, prayers that God has answered, and times when I know that God has been faithful to me, so that then I can look back and I have, my, the history of God's faithfulness to me, so that I can look back and say, oh yeah, He's done this and this and this and this and this. And then I look at it all and I think, well, absolutely my God loves me. And absolutely whatever I'm going through right now, like this is small in comparison to His faithfulness.
Right.
And He will deliver me through this too. So I encourage you to write those things down. But he says, how great are His signs, how powerful His wonders. His kingdom will last forever, His rule through all generations. And then he tells
the story.
That happened to him.
Yeah, then he tells the story. So when you read chapter 4, understand that it's kind of like Daniel took what was sent out to the people and wrote it down in the book. So you kind of have this, when you first read it, it feels like 3 or 4 people are talking at once. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So understand that. I think it helps to understand it as you read it. So he has a dream, another dream, and so he has a dream that scared him. He calls all the wise men together to tell him what the dream meant. Of course, they couldn't. And at last, Daniel came in before me, and I told him the dream. Now, this is in verse 8. He throws something in here, chapter 4, verse 8. And this is what it says. It talks about Daniel's other name. So listen. At last, Daniel came in before me, and I told him the dream. He was named Belshazzar after my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. So that's just a sidebar. So it tells him the dream, and he sees a large tree in the middle of the earth, and the tree grew really tall, and it was birds were in it and all this. And let's see. And everything was fed from the tree. And then this is verse 13, 14. As I lay there dreaming, I saw a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven. The messenger shouted, cut down the tree and lop off its branches, shake off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Chase the wild animals from its shade and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump and the roots in the ground. I think that's really important. Leave the stump and the roots in the ground, bound with a band of iron and bronze, and surrounded by tender grass. Now let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the wild animals among the plants of the field. For 7 periods of time let him have the mind of a wild animal instead of the mind of a human. For this has been decreed by the messengers, is commanded by the holy ones. So now Daniel interprets that dream, and I think there's so much packed into this little part. There's a ton of stuff packed in here. So here's what actually happens. Nebuchadnezzar was proud, and if you read, Daniel says, listen, this is about you. You're this king. He's basically ruling the known world at the time. But you're proud, and God's going to humble you. And when you humble yourself, when you understand that God rules, then you're going to come out of this. But you're going to basically be like a wild animal. And so he explains the dream to Nebuchadnezzar. And then Nebuchadnezzar hears it. About a year later, my Bible says 12 months later, this is verse 29. He was walking, Nebuchadnezzar was walking, and he's talking, he's on the roof, and he's looking out over the kingdom, and he says this, look at this great city of Babylon. By my own mighty power, I have built this beautiful city as my royal residence to display my majestic splendor. Verse 31, while these words were still in his mouth, a voice called down from heaven, O King Nebuchadnezzar, this message is for you. You are no longer ruler of this kingdom. You will be driven from human society. And he was. You will live in the fields with the wild animals, and you will eat grass like a cow. And so we think it says 7 periods of time, and I looked that up, and we think basically 7 years. For those of you that matters to, we'll say 7 years, but it might be more, it might be less. But basically 7 years, he actually was in the fields, like walking around on all fours, thinking he was a cow. If you've never heard of the word, you can talk about this.
It's called boanthropy. Like it's
a real
mental illness. Because I'd never heard of that before. Before reading it, it's like, that's wild, of all the things.
Boanthropy is where you think you're a cow. And that's a real thing. People walk around and they think they're a cow. And that's what happened to him.
But he had a year. He had a year to repent. It says, stop sinning and do what is right. But for a year he didn't, and then bam.
And then he said he finally hit that pivotal proud moment, and then he was crushed.
And we talked last week about pride.
Mm-hmm. It's all over. The beauty of this, and see, Nebuchadnezzar's talking about this. The beauty is he comes to his senses. God helps him understand, and he turns in verse 34. After this time had passed, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven. My sanity returned, and I praised and worshipped the Most High and honored the one who lives forever. His rule is everlasting, and his kingdom is eternal. All the people of the earth are nothing compared to him. He does as he pleases among the angels of heaven and among the people of the earth. No one can stop him or say to him, what do you mean by doing these things? When my sanity returned to me, so did my honor and glory and kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored as head of my kingdom with even greater honor than before. With greater honor, when he humbled himself to God, he comes back with greater honor. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and glorify and honor the King of heaven. All his acts are true and just, and he is able to humble the proud. Chapter 4 is an outstanding chapter, and it's about pride. And they'd say pride cometh before the fall. Literally it does here. And we need to humble ourselves. And in humbling yourself to God, then he promotes you. I mean, that's what's happened for all of these people. Okay, that's chapter 4. And I think we probably need to stop there, maybe.
We'll stop there?
We'll stop there, and we'll pick up later. We'll do 5 and 6 and get into the other stuff later. How's that sound?
I think that sounds good.
I think that's great.
And just one thing, like it's hard to see, I think, when God disciplines people. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the Old Testament that we don't like. and is part of life that I don't like. You know,
I don't like discipline
nobody
children,
likes
but
to
I have to
be
do it.
disciplined.
Yeah.
You know, it's not fun. It's not fun for God either. I'm sure He would much rather us just do what we're supposed to do. What He's told us will bring us life. But we see that there are limits to His discipline. Like He stops, He relents, because He seeks our ultimate deliverance and not our destruction. Yeah. And so even King Nebuchadnezzar, even though he wasn't an Israelite, he sought his restoration and sought his sought to pull him in and show him who he was. And I think that that's just such a neat thing. Nebuchadnezzar's a cool guy anyway.
Yeah, he's really neat.
It's kind of one of those people like Nicodemus, like what happened to him, and like in Nebuchadnezzar, I wonder what happened to him. And,
that's why, like at the beginning, I asked that. Like when you read that, it makes you wonder. I mean, those are his words that he penned.
That's the last thing you hear from him too. All his acts are just and true, and he is able to humble the proud.
Yeah, that's what he ends with.
What a way to end!
He was one of the mightiest kings of Babylon. I guess he was the mightiest king of Babylon. Yeah. So, all right. Well, we're gonna call it a night or a day or whenever you watch it. Thank you so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.
Absolutely.
And if this is up by Sunday morning, hope you have a great Sunday morning.
Fingers crossed. All right.
So thank you all. Susie's gonna hit stop on the thing.
I don't know.
Bye, everybody. Just hit the button on the right. No, on the back, babe. Nope, not on the screen.
Sorry.
On the very back, on the right. The right.
Got it.
There it is. All right. Bye.